The snow had fallen quietly through the night, laying a thin, perfect sheet over the frozen fields of Cedar Falls, Iowa. By morning, the wind had turned sharp, sweeping across the open plains like a blade. From the outside, the Weller farmhouse looked peaceful, smoke rising from the chimney, the faint hum of a radio leaking through the kitchen window. But inside, the silence was wrong. Too deep. Too heavy. On January 12, 1978, 32-year-old Marjorie Weller was found dead in her kitchen. The table was set for dinner. 2 plates. 2 glasses. 1 chair pulled out. She had been stabbed multiple times, 19, according to the coroner's report. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. Her husband, Thomas Weller, told police he'd found her that way when he came home from work. But from the very beginning, something about his story didn't sit right. The investigators noted the missing details: the unlit porch light, the clock stopped at 6:48 p.m., and the single torn letter found near the sink, its ink smudged, its edges burned, as if someone had tried to destroy it in haste. The handwriting was Marjorie's. But the last line, half gone, still whispered something that would haunt detectives for decades. He said he would come back tonight. The murder of Marjorie Weller would remain one of Iowa's most haunting mysteries. For 44 years, the file sat buried in the archives of the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department, its pages yellowed, its truth obscured by time. Until one winter morning in 2022, when a retired officer cleaning out his late father's study opened a box of old evidence and found that same torn letter, sealed in an envelope that was never logged, never examined. And on its brittle paper was a drop of blood. Before we dive into this story of betrayal, buried secrets, and a letter that refused to stay silent, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And don't forget to subscribe to After the Silence, where we bring light to the stories time tried to erase. Because sometimes, justice doesn't fade. It just waits to be read. Chapter 1, The House on Hawthorne Road. The Weller farmhouse sat 3 miles east of Cedar Falls, off a gravel road locals called Hawthorne. Built in 1911, it was the kind of place people drove past without noticing, a weathered 2-story home with a red barn leaning slightly under the weight of decades. The Wellers had lived there for just under 4 years. Neighbors described them as quiet, polite, and private. On the evening of January 12, 1978, a storm rolled over northern Iowa. Visibility dropped to near zero. According to records, Thomas Weller left his job at the feed mill at 5:35 p.m., clocking out early to beat the snow. He arrived home just after 7 o'clock. What he found inside would become the opening entry of one of Iowa's longest-running homicide files. The kitchen light was still on. The radio played softly from the counter, Walmart Cedar Rapids, an AM frequency known for late-night farm reports. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, long since boiled down to nothing but steam. Marjorie lay on the floor, near the table, her body partially turned toward the back door. A carving knife rested under her arm, and beside it, a dish towel darkened with blood. Investigators would later determine the towel had been wrapped around the knife handle during the attack. There were no defensive wounds on her hands. No signs of forced entry on the doors or windows. Her wedding ring remained on her finger. On the counter, a half-open envelope rested beside an unfinished grocery list. Inside that envelope was the torn letter, burned at one edge, the ink faint but legible. The responding officer, Deputy Carl Jensen, noted the details in his report at 7:48 p.m. Front door unlocked. Victim on kitchen floor, supine position. Multiple stab wounds visible. No sign of struggle. One letter fragment located near sink, handwriting appears to match victims. At first, nothing about the scene screamed burglary or revenge. It was eerily domestic, intimate. The sort of violence that doesn't come from a stranger. Within hours, the farmhouse became a crime scene under floodlights. Detectives from the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department and the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation combed through every inch. They dusted for prints, photographed every object, and bagged the torn letter separately. The snow outside had already begun to cover the tire tracks in the driveway, erasing what little evidence the killer might have left behind. The autopsy, conducted 2 days later, confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Marjorie had been attacked between 6:30 and 6:50 p.m. The knife wounds were clustered across her chest and abdomen, deliberate, targeted. The medical examiner's report added one final detail that chilled investigators. She had been stabbed once through the left palm, as if she had raised her hand in a moment of pleading. Her husband, Thomas, was questioned that same night. His demeanor was calm, too calm, some recalled later. He recounted his day minute by minute, from leaving work to finding her body. He mentioned nothing about the letter. But when asked whether Marjorie had received any unusual mail recently, Thomas paused. "Not that I know of," he said. "Just bills. Church newsletters. Nothing else." The detectives exchanged a glance. In the months that followed, rumors spread quietly through Cedar Falls. About the Wellers' marriage. About a man who sometimes visited when Thomas worked late shifts. About the letter that no one in town had seen but everyone whispered about. And yet, as the spring thaw came, so did silence. No new leads. No suspects. The file was stamped cold, pending new evidence. But one detail would linger in every investigator's notes, underlined again and again. Ink sample from torn letter preserved. Unknown origin of second handwriting on reverse side. It would take 44 years before anyone realized what that second handwriting meant. Chapter 2, The Missing Letter. By February of 1978, the snow in Cedar Falls had turned gray, heavy with exhaust and silence. The Weller farmhouse stood empty, its windows boarded, its mailbox frozen shut. For most of the community, the murder had become something whispered about only in grocery aisles and barber shops. A young wife, a quiet husband, a knife in the kitchen, it was too close, too ordinary. Detectives from the Iowa Bureau of Criminal Investigation continued their work long after the headlines faded. They re-interviewed neighbors, family members, and church acquaintances, cataloging more than 100 statements in a binder labeled Case 78-0146. The interviews revealed the same portrait. Marjorie Weller was kind, soft-spoken, often anxious in the months before her death. She had mentioned to a friend from choir that she didn't sleep well anymore. No one knew about the letter. Not yet. The letter, logged as Evidence 14A, was sealed in a standard brown envelope and stored at the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department. The original inventory list described it as partial correspondence, female handwriting, reference to a visitor. When detectives revisited the file in March, it was gone. The chain of custody sheet stopped abruptly on February 9, signed out by a clerk named R. Brinker. Brinker, when questioned, swore he had returned it. It was with the other papers, he insisted. Maybe filed in the wrong box. But the envelope was never located again. Without the letter, the case began to unravel. There were no fingerprints on the knife, no foreign DNA, no witness to the crime. The husband's alibi, verified by his supervisor at the feed mill, placed him 12 miles away at the time of death. Investigators considered every other theory, a break-in, a vagrant, a drifter passing through the area. Nothing fit. By the fall of 1978, the homicide file was reduced to a handful of recurring notes and unsolved questions. The lead detective, Sergeant Bill Avery, would later write in his retirement journal. It was the quietest crime scene I ever walked into. No fight, no forced entry, no robbery. She knew him. Whoever he was, she let him in. Avery remained haunted by that missing letter. The few lines they had copied before it disappeared became his only connection to a motive that never surfaced. He said he would come back tonight. Who was he? Thomas Weller moved out of the farmhouse that same winter. He sold the property to a distant cousin and relocated to Des Moines, where he found work as a mechanic. He never remarried. When reporters approached him years later, he declined every interview, saying only that some things should stay buried. For decades, the case file gathered dust in a metal cabinet in the basement archives of the sheriff's office. The brown envelope containing the letter was presumed lost, perhaps discarded, perhaps misplaced, until 2022, when a retired detective's son cleaning out his father's study found it inside an unmarked box, still sealed. He noticed something the original investigators hadn't: a faint fingerprint and blood on the inner fold of the letter, and on the back, written in small, cramped handwriting, 2 words that changed everything. Forgive me. Chapter 3, The Letter That Waited. The discovery came by accident. In February 2022, 44 years after the murder of Marjorie Weller, a retired officer named Henry Hank Avery began clearing out his late father's belongings. His father, Sergeant Bill Avery, had been one of the original detectives on the Weller case. Inside a wooden trunk labeled 1970s case files, Hank found newspaper clippings, Polaroids from crime scenes, and dozens of neatly stacked envelopes sealed with brittle tape. At the very bottom of the trunk, beneath a yellowed church bulletin and a faded photograph of a snow-covered farmhouse, he found it, a small, brown envelope marked in his father's handwriting. Evidence 14A, Weller case, do not destroy. Hank didn't open it at first. He called the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department the next morning. Within hours, 2 investigators, Detective Laura Kemp and Sergeant Mark Riley, were standing in his kitchen, wearing gloves and recording the unsealing process on camera. Inside was the letter. Folded once, brown with age, its edges singed as if briefly touched by flame. The ink, written in blue ballpoint, had faded into faint strokes. But the final line, the one that had haunted the original investigators, was still legible. He said he would come back tonight. What no one knew until that moment was that there was writing on the back. In the lower right-hand corner, almost hidden beneath the paper's texture, were 2 words in a different hand: forgive me. The team froze. It was clear, from both the style of handwriting and the pressure of the pen, that it wasn't Marjorie's. The ink was darker, fresher, likely from a different pen, perhaps added after her death. Forensic technicians transported the letter to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations Forensics Lab in Des Moines for testing. For the first time, 21st-century DNA methods would meet 1970s paper. Under a microscope, technicians identified a small brown-red stain near the top edge of the paper, invisible to the naked eye. A presumptive test confirmed it was human blood. Samples were extracted from both the stain and the underside of the letter's fold. After decades sealed away, the degraded DNA was fragmented, but technology had advanced enough to rebuild genetic profiles from the smallest samples. By March, the results came back. The blood on the letter belonged to a male relative of Marjorie Weller. That finding cracked open a door that had been sealed for nearly half a century. Investigators reopened the case under the new designation Cold File #1978-046B. Detective Kemp led the team. She was meticulous, quiet, and obsessive about order, the kind of investigator who treated every piece of paper like evidence. She spent days cataloging the entire original file, scanning pages, cross-referencing witness statements, and re-interviewing the few surviving members of the Weller family. One of those was Thomas Weller's younger brother, Daniel Weller, now 71, living in a nursing facility outside Dubuque. When Kemp visited him, he appeared frail, his memory fractured by age and illness. But when she mentioned the letter, his demeanor changed. His hands trembled. "I didn't think they'd ever find that again," he said softly. Kemp asked him what he meant. Daniel stared past her, toward the snow falling outside. "Tom wasn't the same after she died," he murmured. "He said the letter wasn't hers. Said someone left it for him." She pressed for details, but Daniel's recollection drifted into half-formed memories, fragments of conversations and warnings. "He told me once, it was supposed to be him, not her." The phrase struck Kemp immediately. It was recorded verbatim in her report. That same week, forensic genealogists began analyzing the partial DNA recovered from the letter. Using modern sequencing, they isolated Y chromosomal markers, allowing them to trace the paternal lineage. The result pointed to one of 2 possibilities: either Thomas Weller himself, or another male directly related to him through his father's line. But Thomas Weller had died in 1998, his remains cremated. No DNA sample was on record. The only living male relative was Daniel. When Daniel voluntarily provided a buccal swab, the results were astonishing. His DNA matched half of the profile found on the letter. Statistically, this meant that the blood belonged not to him, but to his brother. It had been Thomas all along. Detectives began reconstructing the case from the beginning, this time with modern eyes. Marjorie's body had no defensive wounds. She was comfortable enough to turn her back to her killer. The knife was one of her own. And the towel, carefully wrapped around the handle, had been folded in the distinctive mill press style, identical to how Thomas wrapped his work tools at the feed plant. The implications were devastating. Investigators now believe that the letter had originally been written by Marjorie, a desperate note, possibly to a friend or pastor, warning that someone had threatened her. When Thomas found it, he may have confronted her, leading to a violent argument. During or after the attack, he had attempted to destroy the letter, burning one edge and possibly cutting it, before writing those two final words on the back, "Forgive me." The forensic analysis supported that sequence. The ink from the front had oxidized evenly across the page, while the ink on the back had penetrated the paper fibers unevenly, consistent with being written later, after the blood had already dried. Detective Kemp requested access to the original evidence photos. Among them was a single black and white image showing the letter as it was first found, resting near the sink, half soaked in water. And behind it, on the countertop, a single, circular mark faintly visible in the light. It was a coffee ring. Investigators now believe Thomas had sat down after the murder, poured himself a cup of coffee, and written his last words to his wife before cleaning the scene. The theory explained everything: the missing signs of struggle, the missing fingerprints, the missing letter. He had taken it with him when the police arrived, likely slipping it into his coat pocket while they searched the kitchen. And then, sometime later, Sergeant Avery, one of the first detectives on scene, must have recovered it privately, perhaps out of mistrust for his colleagues or a desire to protect the family. Whatever the motive, that letter had slept in a box for 44 years, waiting for a generation that could read its silent language. When Detective Kemp finished her report, she wrote one line in the margin, echoing her predecessor's words from 1978. She knew him. She let him in. Only now, finally, they knew who he was. Chapter 4, Bloodlines and Silence. By spring of 2022, the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Department had officially reclassified the Weller case from archived homicide to active investigation. The news didn't make headlines. There was no press conference, no official statement. Just a short internal memo circulated among a handful of detectives, with a single sentence in bold. DNA evidence recovered from original letter suggests suspect is deceased spouse, Thomas Weller. The memo was dated April 11, 2022, 44 years, 2 months, and 29 days after Marjorie's death. Detective Laura Kemp had spent months reconstructing the original file. She had retyped every report, cleaned the grainy black and white photos with forensic software, and reassembled the fragmented timeline that had been lost across decades. But as the science began to confirm what intuition had whispered all along, she found herself staring at one question that no laboratory could answer: why had no one seen it before? In 1978, Thomas Weller had been interviewed 3 times. His statements were consistent, his alibi supported by his foreman, and no physical evidence connected him directly to the crime. He had even volunteered for a polygraph, which, according to the technology of the time, he passed. But reading those transcripts now, Kemp noticed something subtle. Each time Thomas referred to his wife, he spoke in the past tense, not Marjorie would have, but Marjorie used to. A linguistic slip, perhaps, but one that detectives today would mark immediately. And then there was the matter of the missing letter. When Kemp cross-referenced the chain of custody logs, she realized something that none of the original investigators could have known. The clerk who had signed out evidence 14A, Brinker, had been Thomas Weller's cousin by marriage. Brinker had resigned from the department in 1979 and moved out of state. He was never questioned again. The pieces, once scattered across decades, were beginning to fit together, not through coincidence, but through blood. The DNA comparison had left no doubt. The sample extracted from the back of the torn letter matched the paternal lineage of the Weller family. But to make the finding legally irrefutable, investigators needed an independent verification. That verification came from forensic genealogist Dr. Alyssa Crane, a consultant who had worked with Parabon Nanolabs on multiple cold cases across the Midwest. Dr. Crane began by cross-referencing the genetic markers with open genealogy databases, not searching for a direct match, but for shared ancestry patterns. Within weeks, she confirmed what the internal lab results had already indicated: the DNA belonged to a male descendant of Edward Weller, Thomas's grandfather. No other living descendants matched the generation, age range, or proximity. In a private meeting at the county courthouse, Dr. Crane summarized her findings in a single phrase that would later be quoted in the case report. The blood on that letter can only have come from Thomas Weller, or his identical twin, and he didn't have one. It was, scientifically speaking, a confession written in cells. As Kemp reviewed the newly verified findings, she reopened the interviews with surviving witnesses. One of them was Pastor Glenn Peterson, then 89 years old, who had presided over Marjorie's funeral. He remembered her as nervous, but kind. When asked if she had ever reached out for counsel before her death, the old man hesitated, adjusting his glasses. "Yes," he said finally. "She came to see me the week before she died. Said she'd written something she wished she hadn't. I told her to pray and let it go. I didn't realize she meant a letter." The statement aligned perfectly with what investigators now knew. Marjorie had written that letter as a confession, not of guilt, but of fear. Kemp pressed further. "Did she say who it was about?" Peterson shook his head. "Only that it was someone close. Someone she couldn't escape." Those words, "someone close," echoed across the sterile meeting room. The following month, the Iowa Attorney General's office authorized a full review of the Weller case, citing newly substantiated forensic evidence. The process was procedural, almost bureaucratic in tone, but to those who had followed the case since the 1970s, it carried the weight of resurrection. On June 3, 2022, Kemp and her team conducted a forensic search of the old Weller property, now owned by a family unrelated to the case. The basement, long renovated, still had traces of the original foundation. Using luminol testing, technicians identified faint traces of blood seeped into the old grout lines beneath the kitchen floorboards. DNA testing confirmed what no one in 1978 could have imagined: the blood belonged to Marjorie. But alongside it, barely detectable, was a secondary male DNA signature, degraded yet present, a near-perfect match to the sample recovered from the letter. The conclusion was unavoidable. The attack had happened precisely where Thomas claimed to have found her. He had staged the discovery scene himself. The next step wasn't a courtroom trial. Thomas was long dead, but rather a formal posthumous indictment. In August 2022, the county district attorney filed a motion to close the case with probable cause of spousal homicide. It was a rare move, used mostly for symbolic closure. For the surviving relatives, it was more than that. At a small press briefing, attended by only local reporters and 2 retired detectives, Kemp read aloud the official findings. Her tone was calm, factual, without drama. After 44 years, the investigation into the death of Marjorie Weller has determined that her husband, Thomas Weller, was the sole perpetrator. The evidence, both physical and genealogical, establishes beyond reasonable doubt that he committed the crime and attempted to destroy the letter she had written shortly before her death. There was no applause. No gasps. Only the clicking of cameras, and the slow exhale of a story finally given its name. Still, one question lingered in every investigator's mind: why hide the letter? The simplest explanation was guilt, the instinct to erase evidence. But Kemp suspected something more complex. The words "forgive me" suggested a moment of fractured conscience, not cold calculation. In her private notes, she theorized that Thomas had written the phrase after the act, possibly in shock, before deciding to conceal it. The crime, she concluded, wasn't born from long-term malice but from a flash of rage, triggered by whatever truth the original letter contained. When the letter was tested for chemical residue, analysts detected trace amounts of paraffin wax, often used in candlelight. It suggested that the confrontation may have occurred at dusk, with the kitchen lights off, explaining the limited visibility, the unlit porch, and the stopped clock. In the silence of that house, amid the fading daylight and falling snow, Marjorie had likely confronted him with something he couldn't bear to hear. A betrayal? A confession? Or perhaps simply the truth that she wanted to leave. Whatever her final words were, they ended with that unfinished line. He said he would come back tonight. Whether she meant Thomas or someone else would never be known. But through the weight of evidence and the clarity of science, her silence had finally spoken. When Detective Kemp archived the final report, she added a handwritten note to the end of her case summary, not for the record, but for herself. Sometimes the truth doesn't hide in darkness. It waits in plain sight, until someone learns how to read it. For the people of Cedar Falls, the Weller farmhouse became a landmark of sorts, not haunted, not cursed, but remembered. A place where a letter written in fear became the bridge between 2 centuries, between silence and confession, between justice delayed and justice, at last, delivered. But memories, like evidence, degrade. Each recollection contradicted another, leaving only outlines, the shape of guilt, not its substance. Among those most affected by the revelation was Daniel Weller, Thomas's surviving brother. He had always defended him. For years, Daniel maintained that his brother wasn't the type, that Thomas had loved his wife, and that grief had made him strange. But when the results came back proving the blood on the letter was Thomas's, Daniel stopped talking. Detective Kemp visited him once more at the nursing home that fall. When she told him the case was officially closed, he simply nodded. Tom carried that letter everywhere after it happened, Daniel said quietly. He told me once he kept it because he didn't know what else to do with it. You saw it? Kemp asked. Once. He was drunk. He said it wasn't hers anymore, it was his. The statement didn't make it into the public record. It was too fragile, too speculative. But for Kemp, it became the final human thread in a story that had turned to evidence in ash. When the Chronicle article reached the descendants of the Weller family, reactions were divided. Some welcomed the closure, others saw it as an intrusion. A niece of Marjorie's, Cynthia Hall, wrote an open letter to the newspaper. Our family never stopped wondering. But we also never wanted revenge. We only wanted the truth, even if it took half a lifetime. Her words echoed across comment sections, church meetings, and local radio segments. For a moment, the story of the Wellers transcended its geography, becoming a parable about the persistence of guilt, the patience of truth, and the quiet cruelty of secrets buried under snow. For Detective Kemp, the case's resolution was both victory and loss. The science had spoken. Justice, in its bureaucratic way, had been served. Yet something in her resisted closure. One evening, she drove out to the old farm site. The foundations were gone, replaced by driveways and trimmed hedges. Only a single oak tree remained, its trunk thick with lichen, its roots tracing the outline of what had once been the kitchen wall. She stood beneath it, watching the twilight settle across the neighborhood. In her mind, she replayed the timeline, the quiet kitchen, the stopped clock, the torn letter. She imagined Marjorie's last moments. Maybe she'd been waiting for someone, maybe she'd left the back door unlocked. Maybe the argument had begun with words, not violence. Maybe she believed, until the very last second, that he wouldn't do it. Kemp took a folded copy of the letter's photograph from her coat pocket. The ink was faint but visible. He said he would come back tonight. She read it aloud, barely whispering the unfinished line. The wind caught the paper, lifting it slightly before she tucked it away again. Weeks later, the state archives digitized the entire Weller file, making it available to criminology students across Iowa. Among the records was the final forensic note written by Dr. Crane, dated October 22, 2022. Evidence supports that the message "Forgive me" was written post-mortem by the suspect, using a pen that leaked trace amounts of his blood. The stroke pattern suggests trembling, possibly remorse or physical exhaustion. Emotional state cannot be determined. The precision of the report left no room for poetry, and yet, within its sterile phrasing, there was something almost human. By winter, the snow returned to Cedar Falls. The town lights glowed against the drifts, and the old stories, once whispered, began to fade again. But for those who remembered, the lesson endured, not just about the limits of justice, but about the strange endurance of truth. A letter written in fear. A signature written in blood. And the long, cold silence between them. Chapter 6, The Archive of Shadows. By early 2023, the Weller case had become something else entirely. Not just a solved murder, but a lesson, a case study in patience, forensic innovation, and the uncomfortable persistence of guilt. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation transferred the full file, photos, audio tapes, autopsy records, and the letter itself, to the National Cold Case Archive, a small but growing repository used by the FBI Academy for Training. The file's new label read: Case Study 1978 Iowa, The Torn Letter. For decades, investigators had taught rookies that evidence never lies. The Weller case taught a more complex truth: sometimes, it simply waits. The letter was displayed only once, under protective glass at a symposium in Quantico. Few attendees realized they were looking at the actual artifact, the same folded paper that had lain beside a dying woman, passed through 2 generations of detectives, and finally given her a voice after 44 silent winters. The exhibit card read: Recovered evidence from the 1978 Weller homicide. Ink, blood, and handwriting analysis solved via forensic genealogy, 2022. For those who saw it, the object itself was underwhelming. Just a torn, brown scrap of paper, one edge scorched, the other smudged. Yet the weight of it, the ordinariness, was precisely what made it haunting. When the session ended, one of the attendees, a young trainee named Evan Pierce, approached Detective Laura Kemp, who had been invited to speak about the investigation. He asked her what it felt like to close something that old. She paused before answering. "You don't close something like that," she said. "You just listen until it stops talking." Her words would later be quoted in Forensic Journal Monthly, beneath a photograph of the letter's faint handwriting, now restored through spectral imaging. Behind the academic tone, though, there was another story, one that never made it into the files. When the DNA evidence was confirmed in 2022, Kemp had quietly contacted Philomena Phyllis Rourke, Marjorie's closest friend from choir. Rourke was 92 and living in assisted care. She hadn't spoken publicly since 1978. When Kemp mentioned the torn letter, Rourke went silent for nearly a minute. Then she said something that changed how Kemp saw the case. "That letter wasn't written for the police," Rourke whispered. "It was written for me." Phyllis explained that Marjorie had been frightened in the weeks before her death. She told her about someone watching the house, about arguments that started over nothing, about a promise she'd made to leave if things got worse. The letter, she said, had been her way of saying goodbye, a message of warning, not accusation. "She told me she'd mail it that Friday," Phyllis said. But it never came. Kemp realized what that meant. The letter hadn't been discovered after the crime. It had never left the house. Thomas had found it first. He had read her goodbye before she died. When the press learned about Rourke's statement months later, they spun it into headlines. The goodbye letter: how a murderer read his wife's final words before killing her. The story reignited national attention. Documentaries followed. True crime podcasts dissected the case, each offering their own theories: jealousy, mental illness, financial stress. But beneath all the speculation, the heart of the story remained painfully simple. A letter meant for one person had ended up telling the world what she never got to say aloud. Detective Kemp stopped giving interviews after that. She said her part at Quantico, and that was enough. In May 2023, the Weller farmhouse site was finally marked by a small bronze plaque installed by the Historical Society of Black Hawk County. It read: "In memory of Marjorie Ellen Weller, 1946 to 1978. Her story reminds us that truth, like winter, returns in its own time." Visitors rarely stopped to read it. the land had changed, the road was paved, the barn's gone. But each December, when the snow began to fall, the plaque disappeared under a soft layer of white, as if the land itself preferred silence. And yet, every few years, the story resurfaced, on forums, in college essays, in quiet conversations between detectives who refused to give up on their own cold files. They would say her name, recall the letter, and remind each other of what it proved. That time doesn't erase. It only delays the inevitable uncovering. Somewhere in the National Archives, stored in a temperature-controlled vault, the torn letter still rests, folded exactly once, just as it was found. The ink has nearly vanished. The blood, too, has faded to the color of dust. But under ultraviolet light, both still glow faintly, a trace of a voice that refused to disappear. And beneath that glow, those same words remain. He said he would come back tonight. Forgive me. Chapter 7, The Echo Effect. For most detectives, cases end when the paperwork does. For Laura Kemp, the Weller file refused to end at all. Even after the press coverage faded and the letter was locked away in the National Archive, her thoughts returned to it, not the blood, or the DNA, or the evidence, but the silence that surrounded it for so long. The decades where it slept unnoticed, just a few feet away from the answers everyone was searching for. In her private journal, she wrote, "It wasn't that no one could find the truth. It's that no one believed silence could hold it." Kemp had spent most of her career in homicide, 31 years cataloging the ways people destroy each other. But this case was different. It wasn't about greed or opportunity or cruelty. It was about something smaller, quieter. The kind of violence that grows slowly, like mold under paint, unseen until it consumes everything. In the months following the Weller closure, other departments began contacting the Black Hawk County Sheriff's Office. They wanted to know how a scrap of paper had led to a confession written in DNA. Within a year, 3 more cold cases across the Midwest were reopened using the same methodology: degraded trace samples preserved on personal objects, a Bible margin, a marriage certificate, a birthday card. The technique was unofficially dubbed the Weller method. At a symposium in Chicago, Dr. Alyssa Crane presented her findings to a crowded room of forensic analysts. Behind her on a large screen was the same image, the torn letter under blue light, its faint ink glowing like a constellation. "This case reminds us," she said, "that artifacts speak when people no longer can. Every document, every touch, every fiber carries intention, even when that intention is to hide." Her words became a sort of mantra in the cold case community. The Weller investigation didn't just solve one murder, it revived dozens. But for those who had lived the story, the echoes were personal. Kemp received letters from people across the country, widows, daughters, sons of victims, thanking her for proving that justice could outlast time. One envelope came from a woman in Oregon, who wrote that her mother's murder in 1982 had also involved a letter that never made it to the mail. "I keep it in a box by the bed," she wrote. "Every time I look at it, I think of Marjorie." Kemp read those words late one night, in her office, long after the building had emptied. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. She realized that the Weller story had become something larger than the crime itself, a symbol, yes, but also a mirror for everyone who'd ever waited for truth to surface. In October 2023, the FBI invited Kemp and Dr. Crane to participate in a joint review of unsolved domestic homicides from the 1970s and 1980s. The program's working title was Project Silence Breaker. Its mission: to locate forgotten evidence, letters, journals, diaries, that might contain overlooked biological traces. When Kemp saw the list of initial candidates, she noticed a pattern. Almost all of them involved women. Almost all of them involved trust. She thought again of that single phrase on the back of the Weller letter, "Forgive me." It wasn't just confession. It was possession. The need to own the narrative, even in guilt. The letter had never been meant to be found. Its reappearance had undone the illusion Thomas Weller spent his entire life maintaining, that silence could be controlled. Months later, while reorganizing her office, Kemp found the last remaining photocopy of the letter's image, the one she'd carried in her notebook. She hesitated before slipping it into the shredder. Then she stopped. Instead, she wrote one more note on its margin. The story isn't that he confessed. It's that she left something behind that refused to stay buried. She folded it once, the same way the original had been folded, and placed it back inside the case file. In Cedar Falls, time moved on. The new residents of Maple Ridge Estates knew the legend, but most dismissed it as folklore, an old murder, exaggerated by memory. Children dared each other to walk past the oak tree after dark. Teenagers whispered about the letter in the ground. But every December, when the anniversary came, someone, no one knew who, left a single envelope at the base of the memorial plaque. Each was blank. Empty. No name. No words. Just silence, folded once. By the end of that winter, Kemp retired. Her final entry in the departmental log read: File hashtag 1978-046B, closed. Evidence preserved. Narrative complete. But in her home office, she kept a copy of the photograph, framed, not for pride, but as a reminder. Beneath it, on a small brass plate, she'd engraved 6 words. Every silence has its own voice. And with that, the Weller case, once forgotten in the archives of time, became part of something larger, a map of how truth, though delayed, always finds a way to speak. Chapter 8, When the Silence Ends. In the end, the Weller case became something neither the investigators nor the family could have predicted, not a story about murder, but about endurance. About how truth, like a current beneath ice, continues to move even when the surface seems frozen. By 2024, Project Silence Breaker had expanded into 11 states. More than 60 dormant files had been reopened using the same forensic approach first tested on Marjorie's torn letter. Some led to arrests. Others to exonerations. And a few, like the Weller case, to the simple naming of ghosts. Each year, forensic trainees at Quantico still study the photographs of that farmhouse kitchen, the grocery bags on the table, the towel-wrapped knife, the stopped clock. The torn letter under the sink. They study it not for the horror, but for the silence, how so much truth can hide in something so still. In Cedar Falls, Detective Laura Kemp's name faded from headlines but remained in reports, cited in training materials, and occasionally mentioned by young detectives who saw her as proof that persistence matters. She never sought recognition. When the department sent her a commendation plaque, she left it unopened in its box. Her life after retirement was uneventful by design. Mornings in the garden, quiet evenings with a book, the phone calls from former colleagues that always began the same way: I found something strange in an old case. And each time, she listened. But the letter stayed with her. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, she'd think about the words that never made it to the mail, and how they had traveled further than the writer ever imagined, from a farmhouse in Iowa to laboratories, conferences, and classrooms across the country. She wondered if, in some way, that was its justice, not punishment, but revelation. In 2025, the FBI's Archival Division quietly updated its public database of landmark forensic breakthroughs. The Weller file was moved to a new category: recovered correspondence evidence. It joined a small group of cases solved by letters, diaries, and notes that time almost erased. The description was brief. Victim, Marjorie Ellen Weller, 32. Discovered, January 12, 1978, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Resolution, DNA match recovered from letter fragment, 2022. Perpetrator, Thomas Weller, deceased. Evidence type, torn personal correspondence, handwritten confession. For those who scrolled past it, it was another line in a list. For those who had lived it, it was an epitaph written in data. Years later, when a journalist preparing a feature on the letters that solved murders tried to reach Kemp for comment, she declined politely. But she enclosed a short handwritten note in her reply. Every case begins with words. Every silence ends the same way, with someone finally reading them. It was signed only with her initials, LK. The journalist included it at the end of her article, beneath a faded photograph of the letter illuminated under forensic light. It became the most quoted line of the piece. Today, the Weller case exists in the thin space between fact and myth, where evidence becomes story, and story becomes warning. For investigators, it's a blueprint. For families of victims, it's a reminder. And for those who study human darkness, it's proof that even the quietest moments can leave traces strong enough to speak across half a century. The farmhouse is gone. The people, too. Only the words remain. He said he would come back tonight. Forgive me. And when the camera fades, when the voice of the narrator softens to that last, inevitable pause, what's left isn't horror. It's something simpler. A silence finally answered. Epilogue, the weight of paper. Winter returns early in Iowa. By late November, frost coats the window panes, and the air carries that familiar stillness, the kind that seems to remember. Each year, on the week of January 12th, a single envelope appears at the memorial site on what used to be Hawthorne Road. It's always blank. Folded once. Placed carefully beneath the bronze plaque that bears Marjorie's name. No one knows who leaves it there. The caretakers say it appears overnight, before the first snow. Some think it's a gesture of respect. Others believe it's habit, an echo carried by someone who once knew the story too well. But to those who understand the Weller case, the envelope means something else. It's not about guilt, or forgiveness, or remembrance. It's about endurance, the quiet insistence of truth, the fragile persistence of a voice that refused to disappear. In the archives, the letter still rests under glass. The ink is almost invisible now, the paper yellowed and fragile. But when the technicians shine ultraviolet light across its surface, the words rise again, faint but certain. The blood still glows. In that glow lives every unanswered question, every silence that waited too long to be heard. The story of Marjorie Weller doesn't end with her death, nor with the confession her husband never spoke. It ends, if it ends at all, with the understanding that even the smallest act of honesty can survive time itself. A torn page. A drop of blood. A sentence left unfinished. He said he would come back tonight. She never knew how right she was. The screen fades to black. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. Some stories aren't lost. They're just waiting for someone to open the letter. And in that pause, before the next case begins, before the silence resumes, the truth lingers, weightless and endless, like snow falling over Cedar Falls.